The AP Royal Oak is one of the most iconic watches. It's a watch that started the entire integrated steel sports watch craze and is often one of the most imitated watches. But there's often a bit of a blurry line when you have something so stylized between imitation and something that is just a product of its time. A good example is if you look at supercars, it's like saying that any wedge-shaped car in the 1980s was a copy of something like the Lamborghini Countach, was the design language of the time. And today we have an example of a watch that really fits that category. It's often compared to being like an homage of the Royal Oak, but the reality is the Royal Oak was released in 1972. And the Laureato released in 1975 means it actually came out before the Nautilus. But there's never any comparison saying that the Nautilus is aping the Royal Oak's idea. And that's because 70s watch design, thanks to the AP, was all about integrated steel sports watches. So today we're going to compare these two and understand really this product of the same time. Is it really worth a third of its equivalent modern AP? Well, let's take a look, and we're going to look at all of the details because this is really what these watches are about, the details. So let's start off with the dials. Both of these examples are black dials, have a hobnail pattern to them. However, when you look really closely with the AP, you can see the level of detail even on a micro level with the tiny little indentations in between the different squares of the hobnail pattern. The Girard Perregaux is very nicely executed, however it doesn't get to that insane level of detail, and then when you zoom out, that just creates for a more exciting dial in the Royal Oak. Moving now to the movements, this is where really one would expect AP to shine, and they do. The Laureato's movement mechanically pretty much matches the AP blow for blow. They both have around 60 hours of power reserve. These are both time and date movements, nothing too special in that sense. The AP does win out by having a full balance bridge, so that means it is a little bit more shock resistant. Both of these are impressive mechanical movements, but the detailing on the AP is just another level. The anglage, the design, the decoration on the rotor itself, all of these different textures that it has, all of these tend to create a much more special feeling when you're admiring the movements of these two watches. When we move on to the bracelet, these are two very different philosophies because the Royal Oak's bracelet is much more focused on the satin finish and just using polish very strategically to play with the light. Meanwhile, on the Laureato you have nice big polished center links and H pattern links that are satin brushed. This mix does create a different aesthetic, however it is much simpler in execution compared to the Royal Oak, which has a much more finessed execution in terms of the way the light subtly plays as you roll the bracelet around. When it comes to the clasps, in this particular case, this particular Royal Oak with the modern clasp is definitely much nicer than what you see on the Girard Perregaux. Normally this is something that you would say for comparing dive watches, for example. But on watches like this, every detail has to count. And again, that's another area where the AP just elevates it a little bit further. Even in the finish between the two, you can see they've used differential finish on the clasp. Not even just the whole bracelet, the clasp, they've selectively used different finishes to bring everything out. And that really is where it comes down to when it comes to the price difference between these two. And that is in terms of the overall finish. But we've talked a lot about where the Royal Oak shines. Let's focus a bit more on the Laureato. In terms of the fluidity of the bracelet, the Laureato is much more comfortable in that sense. The Royal Oak feels like a heavier watch, whereas the Laureato, despite also being in stainless steel, somehow feels a little bit lighter on the wrist. Also in terms of practicality, the Laureato does have the Royal Oak beat with 100 meters of water resistance versus only 50 meters. In terms of legibility, the bigger indices make it a little bit easier to read, and because they are finished in a simple polish versus the more faceting that you see on the Royal Oak indices, again, it just makes them a little bit easier to read. And one interesting detail where I think the Laureato definitely jumps the Royal Oak is in the font selection for the date disc. It's a very, very small detail, but on the Royal Oak it looks much simpler, almost a little bit sterile and out of place, whereas the flourishes on the font of the Laureato look just a little bit more special. At the end of the day though, given the price disparity between these, it's unlikely anyone's really going to be comparing these from a purchasing perspective. However, it's very important to remember when you look at it through that lens of this is still a product of that era. If you want an integrated steel sports watch that's well made with a manufacturer caliber on the inside and still has a solid amount of attention to detail and arguably a little bit more usability than a Royal Oak, the Laureato offers an amazing alternative and also an amazing entry into this world of higher horology steel sports watches. Luckily for us, we have both of these available at Chronext. However, if it was your decision, which would you pick between these two? First money, no object, and then factoring in the price difference between these two. Do you think that the Royal Oak is worth 3 times the Laureato? Do you think that the Royal Oak is 3 times the watch than the Laureato? I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, if you like this video, make sure you like it and share it. If you want to see more videos about watches, then make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell as well so you know when the next video comes out. Thank you though for joining us on this quick comparison of the AP Royal Oak and the Girard Perregaux Laureato, and we'll catch you on the next video.